Let me formally introduce Dr. Chaudhuri. Dr. Amit Chaudhuri is the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Friend of My Youth. He's also an essayist, poet, musician, and composer. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Awards for his fiction include the Commonwealth Writers Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and the Indian government's Sahitya Akademi Award. In 2013, he was awarded the first Infosys Prize in the Humanities for outstanding contribution to literary studies. His first novel, and I think I must say my most favorite one till date, A Strange and Sublime Address, is included in Toibin and Carmen Callil's The Modern Library, the 200 best novels of the last 50 years. And his second novel, Afternoon Raag, was on the novelist Anne Enright's list of 10 best short novels for The Guardian. Its 25th anniversary edition appeared earlier this year with a new introduction by the critic James Wood. The BBC recently called him the best living writer of the English sentence. In 2017, the government of West Bengal awarded Chaudhuri the Sangeet Samman for his contribution to Indian classical music. He's professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia and was, in 2018-19, University College London's annual visiting fellow. He was recently an inaugural fellow at the Columbia Institute of Ideas and Imagination in Paris, and in November 2019 became an honorary fellow at Balliol College, Oxford. So a very warm welcome to you, Amida. Thank you so much for making it to this event. Let me very briefly read out the abstract that has been shared for those of us who may not be in the know of the context for the conversation. And the title for this conversation is Narrative and Non-Narrative Tendencies, Indian Literatures in the Vernacular and in English. And let me briefly read out the abstract and maybe open up the conversation with the first question. Is literary writing, so Amita writes in the abstract, is literary writing in the Indian languages primarily characterized by authenticity, and Indian writing in English by its access to a global readership? He rejects this dichotomy. Amita rejects this dichotomy, although he finds the formal and aesthetic differences between Anglophone and non-Anglophone writing in India deeply revealing. In this conversation, he aims to reconsider what these differences mean to him in light of his own proclivities as a writer and reader. So to open up this conversation, maybe the first question that I would want to ask you here is this question of language, which is of course central to what we are talking about today, and whether or not there are certain connections between language and the kind of narrative experiments you're talking about in that expression narrative and non-narrative, and also the kind of narrative experiments we see, for example, in your fiction, starting from Strange and Sublime Address, where there is a certain lineage of that modernist plotlessness of the novel, and there's a very specific, I suppose, engagement with novella or novelette as a form as well. So I was just wondering whether in this particular debate and this dichotomization of the authentic Indian English, the authentic Indian literature, which is your questioning in a way, this discourse, whether you see a connection between language and narrative, as well as non-narrative.
So when thank you for that, Arka, and so when you and thank you for spotting this. Because we are basically discussing this because you spotted me making a comment about this in a discussion on Friday, right? When I was launching my a website that I'm editing called literaryactivism.com, and you said, "Is this something that you'd like to talk about further?" And it's something that I have actually written about to a certain extent and talked about for a long time. But maybe never actually devoted an entire discussion to this subject. But before I engage with your question, Can you tell me what exactly do you mean by language? I mean, are you talking about language as in English, Bangla, or are you talking about features
Yes.
of language?
Yes, I mean, primarily this debate, which I suppose you were in a way drawing on in your comments the other day, and
Okay.
also, I mean, that's what in a way interested me. This question of language as we understand in the so-called Bhasha literary traditions in India, and the Indian English writing, which is this twice-born Indian fiction, to use that famous Meenakshi Mukherjee phrase. So I was just wondering, as an Indian writer writing in English language, so from that perspective, I'm using the word language there, and its connections with narratives.
Okay. So let me gather my thoughts. Uh, Bhasha literature. Now, where does that term come from? I mean, how old is it? Bhasha means language, right? And so all literatures are in some bhasha or another. Um, so uh, so writing in English is also a bhasha literature.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so so uh, so the term, I was certainly not aware of any such term when I was growing up in the 70s, or when I was a student in the 80s. You know, so at some point that the term began to be used, and I think it might have been a reaction um, to the sudden dominance of both the English language and the new dominance of Indian writing in English, and the novel specifically in Indian writing in English. After the 80s, after Midnight's Children appeared, but also in the 90s, um, after the Berlin Wall fell and the world became globalized, and we gradually began to forget what had preceded globalization. Um, so, so in that new continuum, it may have seemed like the set of values that were suddenly imposed upon us, to do with measuring the success of something, the 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 um, the deservingness of something of attention, uh, how how we decide that such and such thing automatically deserves attention, and how we consign other things to being not only marginal but non-existent almost. A new set of values to do with this came about, I think, uh, after free market globalization became the norm, with which we thought about various things, including what we continue to call literature. Um, and and uh, and along with the coming of those norms, also came a sense of false continuity, in the sense that we felt that it had always been like this. We could not remember a time when it was any different. um, I think there was great anxiety at this stage when, um, at least in the arena of writing and Indian writing, when the Indian novel in English suddenly became conflated with Indian writing. There would have been great anxiety among Indian writers who wrote in other languages, uh, at this and this revolutionary sort of upheaval, uh, which completely changed the kind of the kind of parity that had existed earlier, and the parity which did not depend on necessarily approbation from, within quotes, abroad. So Buddhadev Bose you know, for instance, you take a name at random, didn't really care about whether his works were read by American readers or not. Well, probably he would have liked to have been translated into English. Uh, Being an extraordinary writer of the English language himself in his essays, he still didn't spend a lot of time translating his own work into English, which he would have had he felt that kind of anxiety. So there was that kind of parity there, uh, which even pertained to those who might have felt that they are on some level invisible but self-sufficient. So, you know, although Tagore got the Nobel Prize, um, I'm not sure, even in the 19th century and what followed in the early 20th century, in terms of the Bengali literary tradition, how much visibility was a kind of issue in terms of determining the value of what they were doing, and visibility to the British, let's say. That invisibility seemed to be an irrelevance. There was an inner kind of circle of who was marginal and who was central. That was much more real. And the invisibility did not preclude the kind of transactions that were going on imaginatively with various aspects of European literature or other literatures in these writers. That seemed to be more important than, let's say, getting their work published abroad. These transactions that were going on, that seemed to be as I said, all of that went a revolutionary change, underwent a revolutionary change in the 80s, but then certainly in the 90s. I mentioned the 90s, I mentioned the kind of fall of the Berlin Wall, I mentioned this magical kind of birth of this new world, even more emphatically than I do the 80s, because as I said earlier, the ability to remember the terms in which the previous world had existed also disappeared. A complete amnesia about what it means to have thought in those terms. You can only think in these terms. Now, in these terms, the anxiety would have led Indian writers writing in Indian languages to speak up for their validation through authenticity or homegrownness, if there is any such word, of rootedness. Kind of variation on what would then become also, I mean, the discourses of identity, but you know, not necessarily so in those terms, but precursors of that. So Bhasha writing would be born as a self-definition at that time. I
think sorry, Amit, just give me a second. I don't know. I think it's Oporupa. Could you please switch off your audio? And may I request everyone to keep their audio switched off, please? Thank you so much. Sorry about that, Amit. Please continue.
It happens. So I found that these Indian writers, extremely interesting Indian writers, whose work I was drawn to, and I'll tell you in a second how I became drawn to their work, beginning to argue for themselves in terms of their rootedness in location, the fact that apparently they had a real community of readers, while the Indian writer in English could only ever hope to gain success by pandering to a Western readership. all these arguments that are, you know, also arguments to do with the validity of one's identity in a sense, cultural identity, began to express themselves. And what began to get left out of these pronouncements was that the, the avant-garde experimental or modernist traditions that many of these so-called bhasha writers or regional writers uh, represented in terms of their oeuvre and the literary traditions that they came from, that seemed to somehow never get mentioned. You know, that uh, that their writing and their traditions might be interesting because of what because of their take on experimentation, their take, their contribution to modernity and modernism. Um, and and they position themselves as writers who are validated by community and authenticity. Um, and Indian writers in English were supposed to be these global writers. Yet I often found that the Indian writers in English were provincial in comparison to, let us say, Indian writers in English from the 60s who were poets, like, let's say, Kolatkar or Mehrotra or various other people who, like their counterparts in the Indian languages, were interested in making connections with poetry and artwork and even film from various parts of the world. But what happened with the globalized novel in English everywhere, and certainly in India as well, is that it became an extremely enclosed form. All you did was write novels, behave like a novelist, launch novels, talk about novels, and it became a typical self-celebrating mode of that came about post-globalization. You know, there were no distractions. There was only this question of celebrating something, which was like a metaphor for globalization. So it needed to be diverse, multicultural, and yet enclosed. Um, so it seemed to me a pity that the actual nature of the tension was not being pointed out, not coming to the forefront of our consciousness, where we could maybe do business more interesting business with it. You know, that some of our most interesting writers, like U.R. Ananthamurthy, should suddenly find themselves trapped in this discourse to do with authenticity, rather than inquire into their multiple provenances in modernity, in modernism, and you know the astonishing contributions that made to that lineage. I'll give you remind me to give you an example from Ananthamurthy later, which will sort of maybe further illuminate what I'm trying to say.
So just to pick up on some of the threads you mentioned there, this idea of the audience or the readership, who would read the Indian vernacular novels and who would read the Indian English? For the time being, staying with the novel form, because in a certain way, the globalized value system that you were talking about there would also have perhaps a different logic vis-a-vis poetry and novel. Novel always being considered the more marketable genre, perhaps, than compared to poetry. But I wanted to ask you something which is related to this, but at the same time, it might take us into a slightly different territory. And this goes back to the comment you made that day during the launch of the literary activism website. And it'll be very interesting, I'm sure, not just for me, but for others as well, to listen to your slightly more elaborate view on this particular point. So if I remember correctly, you were making a kind of a differentiation between the Indian English novel as a more national genre and in certain ways the vernacular novelistic traditions being more non-linear in relation to their approach to the nation as such, and they belong in the species of the poetic in a certain way that perhaps the Indian English novel doesn't. And you were making this kind of a, I won't call it a binary, but it's a juxtaposition, let's say, some sort of a juxtaposition. So I would be very interested in listening to that particular view in a slightly more detailed way, also because it goes back to that connection between some of the, and again I'm drawing on what you said that day. It's a connection between the sort of the rich histories that are there in our vernacular traditions, and it's a question of how the Indian English novel, let's say, or writing more generally, can embody those rich histories without being trapped in this anxiety that you were, pointing out there. So how can we have more of an interaction rather than this, fight, as it were? And as you already pointed out, there's a sort of a falsity to that fight itself. I mean, to a certain extent, at least. So yeah, I mean, that'll be great if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay, let me see if I can. So let me relate the anecdote about Anantamurthy before I forget. Um, a couple of things about Anantamurthy. The first one was, we were all on this kind of typical global junket for writers. We had gone to the Paris Book Fair, and the theme was India, and this would have been in 2007 or something like that. And a whole lot of writers were there, including Anantamurthy. But of course, I mean, uh, the new topography meant that it would be the Indian writers in English who were, as it was, center stage, you know. Anyway, we were all traveling between the hotel and the kind of warehouse-like location where the book fair was taking place on a bus, and then returning to the hotel. And many people would just stay put um, in the hotel at other times and never go anywhere. All they went to in Paris was the book fair, and then came back to the hotel. So I on the bus I said to somebody, it feels like the Eiffel Tower is following us about, because wherever the bus went, you could see the Eiffel Tower shift location but keep kind of pace, as it were, with the bus. And Anantamurthy said, yes, who was it who said that to escape the Eiffel Tower, you must go inside it? And then he said, was it Roland Barthes? And it was, of course, Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes was quoting Maupassant, but his essay on the Eiffel Tower begins with that quotation: "To escape the Eiffel Tower, you must go inside it." So it struck me just how multiply located intellectually Anantamurthy was. And yet he was one of those people who had been reduced to, speaking on behalf of his work and his language in the terms of authenticity. And it struck me that very few people on that bus who were Indian writers in English would have known that reference. So it made me think about Anantamurthy and his own explorations of disjunction in his work, where, contrary to what he's saying, he's uh, constantly dealing with the fact that he has no, that he's displaced from an audience, displaced from community. It runs through samskara, where where a Brahmin who has erred in his life, has become an outcast, is awaiting to be claimed for funeral rites. You know, because he's done something wrong, he's just lying there. And and a horse for the sun, where in fact a man called Ananta goes back to his village and feels, he suddenly sees his old friend Venkat standing there, buying vegetables from a vegetable stall. And Venkat has all that kind of air of contentment that Ananta has lost. And yet all that simplicity which Ananta wants to leave behind. So these are not the writings of a man who feels at one with his community. If anything, Indian modernity has explored this disjunction in very, very interesting ways, and far more poetically than an Orientalist could, in the sense that far more poetically than a Western person coming to India writing about the landscape could. I mean, some of that disjunction uh, is also to be found in that kind of work, going right back to Kipling, where you have the great sensory impact of a landscape and a rejection of the culture where that landscape is located. But this kind of negotiation is done so much more poetically and tenderly and beautifully and illuminatingly in writers like Anantamurthy, because it is, because what they are drawn to and what they no longer feel happy with is their own milieu, something they have left behind. Um, and so, so this is something that I think is, runs through the literature and the cinema in such interesting ways, um, and anybody who feels um, slightly out of place in their own location in Indian writing in English will begin to look outside of that domain, outside of the Indian novel, towards these other locations and their histories. And this is, I think, what happened to me. Because I felt no sense of recognition in the values that we were supposed to celebrate and adhere to as Indian novelists in the English language. I felt no sense of kinship or recognition. I'm not saying that I didn't admire uh, Indian certain Indian novelists who wrote in the English language, but the project came couched in a rhetoric, which and a paradigm which I did not find congenial. And given the kind of anomalous journey I had uh, taken up of writing short novels, which, which kind of were uninterested in completion and uninterested in representation, and therefore also uninterested in a sense in this category called India. I wanted to be able to say, without it being scandalous, but it being liberating, that I was not interested in India. And I found this in the writings and the literary histories in these other language, a lack of anxiety to do with embodying the nation, or some kind of completeness, allowing themselves to be spasmodic departures, each one of composed of spasmodic departures. That I liked a lot, and I think this whole thing connected to India is extremely interesting, because everywhere I think people make academics make it a habit of connecting literary traditions, especially modern literary traditions, to the nation. And it is interesting to see how many writers actually look at literature as as a as a form which is not validated by its connection to the nation. That is not to say that it is it it has no connection to location or history, but it is a different way of thinking about location and history from, let's say, nationalism, or the social sciences, or discipline, and disciplines like history itself. You know, it's a different way of thinking about these things, a way that throws a challenge to these other ways of thinking about the same thing. So I think these arguments are made, quite powerfully in the Indian languages, which seem to be sort of aiming to create forms of expression that kind of slip away, or escape being pinned down to the nation each time you attempt to do so. You like that, there's in one of the Tintin comics, there's a spider, and on the ground, and Rastopopoulos, the villain, says, he says to Tintin, I think, "I will crush you like this insignificant spider." And then he tries to stamp on the spider, but the spider gets away each time. So rather like that spider, we have these forms depending on their vitality, to a certain extent, on not embodying the national. You know, so in that sense, there is this connection maybe with the regional in American literature too, which is another, great nation, which is supposed to have thrown up at least the desire to write something called the great American novel. And yet you have the very compelling forms of regional awareness in literature over there. But if you look at regional awareness in literature over there, or if you look at the regional over here, usually we think that this has to do with an assertion of regional identity. It doesn't. It seems to have to do with an assertion of the value of strangeness. The region is where the strange happens. The province, the local, is what is completely unknown and strange. And this seems to give energy to these forms of writing. And that I'm drawn to that.
So just to continue on that particular thread a little bit, in a country which is as multilingual, and in that sense, as even though the word multicultural may not be perfect for a country like India, but let's say inherently cosmopolitan and multilingual, a country like India, where we have this, and it's something that is true for other countries too, of course. So in the world literary discourse, when we talk about regional form, there's a certain way in which the regional form also becomes a world form, and uh, in a way collapses that binary opposition between the region and the nation. I mean, the reason I say this is that, especially in a country like India, our so-called national identifications are quite often a regional identification. And the rest is almost like an inductive construction. Again, remembering that sort of Joycean echo you had in Strange and Sublime Address. And I'm going to say something which goes back to Com Toibin's introduction to your novel in the 25th year edition. And recently I was writing something on Irish literature as world literature, and I was looking at these two encounters, the Yeats-Tagore encounter, and in a way the encounter that is mapped in that little but not so little introduction in Toibin's reaction towards reading your book. And one of the interesting things, I mean, there are many things that he says which could be brought in, but just for the purposes of time, I'll bring in one particular point where he says, so I was expecting, Toybin says, certain things from a book like this because it's an Indian novel. I was expecting some insight on the caste system and so on. But I like the book precisely because it frustrates my desires on those accounts. And this again made me go back to some of the things. I mean, I was reminded of this when you were talking about the way in which we could have this sort of non-linear approach and not necessarily a bypassing of the national, but maybe a reconfiguration of anything like a national, and also questioning it. I mean, not taking it for granted, but questioning it. Because this very strong sense of speciality that we see in your early 90s novels, as well as, you know, the more recent ones, especially I'm thinking of the novel, I think it's Odysseus Abroad, right? Odysseus Abroad, where again, we go back to that sort of modernist character of Odysseus, again, much eulogized and also critiqued to a certain extent in Ulysses, in Joyce's novel. But also, there's a certain return to that bilocational thing we see in Strange and Sublime Address, which is located again in between Kolkata and Bombay, as it were. So there's a certain way in which I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this question of migration and a space of a space of flows where we are not necessarily talking about one particular city or one particular country, for that matter. I mean, in a way, the Odysseus we see in your novel is a Bengali person, but the novel is almost entirely set in London, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So there's again that kind of a bilocational structure, which and may not be bi, it might be more than that. But I'm just wondering about this question of space, and if you could say a little bit more on that, that's one. And very briefly, I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about your linguistic choice, because again, unlike certain other writers, and again, I was thinking about this because, as you pointed out and indicated as well, it is difficult to categorize your novels in the formation of the so-called post-colonial Indian English novel. It is difficult, and that's one of the reasons why, in a certain way, I would see, and this is a personal comment, of course, I would see more along the line, I would see your work more along the lines of an Indian modernism of sorts in literature, rather than a post-colonial Indian English novelistic discourse that we have with the inception of, you know, Midnight's Children or novels like that. So I was wondering if you could also comment a little bit around the question of language and narrative, but also in relation to these two things, post-colonialism on the one hand, and a more vernacular, multifocal modernisms that we have in India. We've always had in many different linguistic traditions.
Yeah. Okay. So the post-colonial novel and what was the other one? Let me just go back to what you said about Colm Toibin, and what he says about his expectations as to what an Indian novel should contain, and finding something which doesn't kind of fulfill those expectations, but but that not being a negative thing for him. So again, I would say that uh, one is possibly sort of uh, dealing with all kinds of things in a work of fiction, but not dealing with it as uh, mm, as a work of history would. Um, so so that means that there are no stable categories in that work, um, whereby one can fulfill uh, expectations. The novel or the work of imagination which fulfills something you already know is not a work of the imagination. It is a um, it is a work with it is part of an agreement arrived at by the liberal middle class, you know. So unless the work estranges you, um, I don't think it is a work of the imagination. However, we think that works which confirm what we know and what we believe in, and the values that we believe in, to be legitimate works. Um, but I don't think it is the job of a work of the imagination, firstly, to to desire legitimacy. But but while we make all our noises about canons and canon formation and all of that, we do live in everywhere, but especially in India, in a culture that is deeply preoccupied with legitimacy. What's legitimate and what's not legitimate. Um, so this is something that this kind of thinking is something that the work of the imagination must question and offer something else, another way of thinking about these things, you know. So what he was probably saying was that my work did not bear the markers of legitimacy. What it would have had or taken to be a bona fide Indian novel. It did not have those bona fides, and that I think is my job, you know, not to have those markers of legitimacy, and not to be overdetermined. So if we think about things um, in literature, we are always thinking about things in literature, but we do not think about them in an overdetermined way. The argument is all has long been to do with the conscious part of ourselves and the unconscious part of ourselves. Whether we go back to Romanticism, whether we go back to Keats and negative capability, or whether we go back to Rabindranath in his essay on literature, Sahitya, from 1889, I think, he makes a distinction between construction and creation, and he says in construction the mind has power over inert materials, but not so in creation. So we are talking about a kind of voluntary uh, giving up of power for in order for something else to open up, some other possibility to open up. And then arriving at a place where we learn how to do that. We learn how to conceive of things, write about things without the will, as it were. And then, of course, there are many other writers from various sort of sides of the argument who feel that this is so, whether it's Woolf or whether it's Lawrence or whether it's Eliot. They're all critiquing an overdetermined consciousness and talking about how one might negotiate with something that is in that way not overdetermined and, you know, not conscious. How might one negotiate with that? Once you go down that route, you cannot have these markers. The markers are always a result of decisions that are made wholly from the conscious part of yourself. And if the conscious part of yourself then also, you know, the conscious part of yourself looks at the creation of character and the creation of history very similarly. That is, it'll think, I want to create a character, and this is something that Woolf has talked about in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. And she says Mr. Bennet thinks of character as the sum total of a person's appearance, how they dress, and their surroundings. So I will write in a way where I'm trying to create, let us say, a working class character who's in their house or flat, and I will try to give you all the details that contain the markers of her class, milieu, and who she is. So, you know, one can also look at history in the same way, that I know what history is. I need to find out its various I need to go to the archive and do some research on it. And then I need to put it together in the way that Woolf is saying Bennett is putting together certain markers or characteristics to create character. And all of this comes from a privileging of the conscious mind and its relationship of power to inert materials. And its belief that there is something called, let us say, character or history in its completeness, which I can access by putting it together. I would say the same about a word which you use, cosmopolitan. The way Indians often look at cosmopolitan is very constitutional. What they mean is Parsis, Sikhs, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, add them all up, and then you come up with something called cosmopolitan. This again is a way of thinking that is overdetermined, that is determined through the mind's kind of relationship with power to what you already know. All the categories are known. Nothing that is known is being disturbed. So what we are looking at are forms of writing, forms of knowledge, where that kind of power is forfeited. That certainty that we already know this and this is valuable and now I must produce more of this is forfeited. And we allow ourselves to negotiate, which is negotiate this kind of relationship with what is not completely mastered or completely known. Once you do that, you cannot produce this novel that Colm Toibin had expected. And what was your second question? I'm sorry, I spent such a lot of time on Colm Toibin.
Oh, I was just wondering about the lineage of modernist style, which actually again came across in the example from Woolf and the essay that you mentioned there, and because and again I'm partially reacting to your work as a reader here. I've always seen in your work a certain stamp of that modernist style of introspection, which is more interested in what happens within rather than what happens without. And that is not to say things don't happen, but even if they do happen, you're more interested in how a character notices experience, registers experience, rather than the experience that happens. And it's a very impressionistic, almost a delicately poetic style where perhaps to a certain extent, I don't know whether it's entirely correct to say that, whether your own vocation as a poet also invades the form of the novel and creates a certain experimental matrix there. But the question that I was wondering about, I mean, there are two questions that I'll be brief because I think it's about time we also open it up to questions and answers at the end. But one is what you think determined your choice to write in English? The question of linguistic choice is one thing I had in mind. And the other is, I mean, do you see some sort of a tension between the experience of modernity that, in a way, your work engages with in the Indian context, let's say, and the let's say the post-colonial ramification of the Indian novel as a form, which is perhaps a slightly different engagement with Indian modernity?
So I write in English because I grew up in Bombay, and I didn't learn Bangla well enough to begin to consider writing in. So, writing in a language requires a great deal of intimacy with its kind of various registers. It requires you to have literary models, which you will try to kind of live up to in an apprenticeship at some point. Um, but for that, you need to be a voracious reader in that language. Uh, none, I was, yeah, I went to school in Bombay. When I was admitted to school, at that time, of course, I knew no English because my parents had only spoken to me in Bangla when I was growing up, and um, and so I had to learn English after I was admitted to school. And uh, the way it happened was the headmistress told my mother, give him comic books to read and ladybird books to read, and he'll pick up the language. And that is how I picked up English after I got admitted to that school. Um, but I was never a studious boy. In fact, I hated school, you know. And so it was unlikely that I would then do any of the extracurricular kind of work that I was supposed to do at home, uh, that I would need to do in order to pick up a language like Bengali. I mean, my mother did um, get me a few teachers now and again to teach me Bangla when I was in Bombay. But I didn't want to do the work in school. I didn't want to do naturally any work outside of school. So it was very unlikely that I would pick up Bangla. So that's why I write in English. I mean, the question is, why do I write the novel? I mean, that is a question that I have uh, uh, wondered about, and I'm going to write something about quite soon, I hope, because I do with the novel what I'm not doing, I'm not supposed to be doing, and then why do I create this problem for myself? In going to a particular form, which I then use not for what it's meant for. Um, why not do some? Why not write other kinds of stuff in some other form? Um, I'm going to write about this. Now, the fact that I mentioned this makes me think I can relate it to your other question, the post-colonial. In the post-colonial, this kind of question um, the philosophical question of form, of writing, the question I just, which I put to you, which is on the one hand philosophical and on the other hand frivolous. That is, why do I, and on some other hand, maybe quite basic and puzzling. Why do I write the novel? What is the compulsion that seizes me to write the novel when all it does is create a problem for me, which I then have to find ways to surmount in order to create something which is clearly not by common consensus a novel. Why do I do this time and time again? Now, I think that kind of a question is not addressed by post-colonial literary studies among the various questions that are not addressed, including many of the things we talked about today. Um, the kind of writer that Ananthamurthy is, the kind of writing he did, his comment on the Eiffel Tower and Roland Barthes, his pushing for Kannada as an authentic language, for Kannada literature as a receptacle of authenticity, his writing as a rebuttal or a puzzling over the authentic, or a mourning of the authentic, as in, and a celebration of it, as in A Horse for the Sun. I think none of these things get covered in post-colonial discussions. Or maybe I'm not au fait with these discussions in their present form, but I don't think from a memory of them that these things get covered. There is also a huge onus put on theme in post-colonial studies, but this is not peculiar to post-colonial studies. It's the way of thinking now. It's the way of thinking that earlier forms of literature and philosophy rejected. The rejection of the thematic as being a kind of shorthand for some kind of knowledge. If there is nothing fixed about knowledge, if it begins and the argument begins again each time, then we cannot have these large thematic categories. We can only have readings and rereadings. And as you call, the act of noticing. The act of noticing has to do with the fact that you do not live in a static reality. You notice what was in front of you. It's not as if you hadn't seen it before. Noticing is not the same thing as encountering and seeing. It is to see again. And it depends on this fact, on this idea that, knowledge is not thematic, is not static. So I would want post-colonial studies to include these questions and to challenge itself through these questions.
Maybe one last very quick question before we move over to the Q&A, because it, in a way, comes out of the kind of comments you're making there. And I was just, again, wondering about this negotiation. This has been a very complex negotiation between post-colonial literature in India and various kinds of, let me not say modernist, but modern literatures. Not all of them were, technically speaking, modernist, but they were modern. At least they had a certain conception of literary modernity built into them. But this tension that you point out between the aesthetics of literary form and the thematics of post-colonialism, let's say, this also made me think about two writers who did two different kinds of negotiations, and I was wondering where you would see your practice in relation to them. One is Rushdie, where we have a very involved literary form with its own experiments. And at the same time, thematically, at least in the early work, there is an engagement with, let's say, post-coloniality as a condition. I'm thinking of Midnight Children's Shame and that early phase of his writing. But it's interesting how he has also gone back to some of these modernist forms, like, for example, the narrative of Don Quixote, which frames his latest book. But also a writer like Anita Desai, who has again made a very interesting negotiation in the sense that, yes, there are post-colonial aspects in her writing, but then I would see more continuity between your writing and someone like Anita Desai's writing, precisely on the basis of that modernist lineage of introspection, and again, what I was terming as some sort of an interiority that sees the exteriority rather than the other way around. Because, I mean, we live in times where it's almost absolutely external. I mean, there's a certain absolute form of exteriority which has now invaded us with the digital revolution and a lot of these things. How do we preserve interiority has become quite an anxious question now at times. And I was just wondering again in relation to, so there have been like multiple ways of negotiating between modernism and postcolonialism in Indian English writing, let's say. Where would you see yourself in that sort of matrix with other writers?
Okay. First, I have to. Okay, let me answer this. I mean, I hope I'm not going to be taking away from the time given to Q&A, but I feel that I should make some clarifications over here. Um, when I began to write a Strange and Sublime Address, I was aware of, various things that I would be doing and not doing. One of the things that I um, didn't want to do was for the story to have some kind of recounted air, and therefore a story about my childhood, which it was not. So I wanted to be a story that basically enshrined what it means to live in the present moment, and that the source of excitement should lie there, that it is the present in which one is making discoveries. Uh, so that was one decision I took, that it should not appear to be remembered or retold. It should not appear recounted. It should reject that. The other thing that I rejected was um, interiority. So when I was growing up, so I was born in '62. So around the time I was a teenager, the intellectual buzzwords had to do with words like existentialism, uh, absurd, the absurd. Um, you've worked on Beckett. So when I was growing up, I mean, Beckett was subsumed under that narrative. You know, everything um, that looked like it might be given a legitimacy, to return to that word, through a particular kind of gravitas, which also connected itself to the traumas of Western history, the so-called fracturing of the 20th century, the Holocaust. I mean, these were the intellectual underpinnings of that gravitas. Anything that could then be brought within that topography was and called absurd or existential. So we missed the humor. We didn't notice, you know. So there was Kafka, who we saw as some acting out some parable in his writings about the existential. We missed Kafka's humor and his great sense of delicacy and his delight in the everyday. We missed Beckett's humor. We missed Bergman's kind of wonderful ways of seeing things, and his humor in Smiles of a Summer Night, in various other films, his love of the sensory. We didn't know about Camus' love of the sensory until The First Man was published in the 90s. We allowed him to fit into that absurdist paradigm, which was basically an interior, non-sensuous kind of self-consciousness. And I thought, when writing A Strange and Sublime Address, I had to chuck this out, I have to get out of this. No psychology, no character, nothing for me. I don't want that. I want to be out into the street, or at least at a window where I'm pulling the khorkhori or the slats to be able to see part of the street. Let myself leak out from there into what's outside. Let me be connected from this self by desire to what's on the glimpsed on the opposite balcony. That act of glimpsing, that leakage, that desire which connects you from one window to what's behind the other window, I found in film, in cinema, and that became to me more important than interiority, and more important than narrative. Again, going back to what you talked about, noticing. The glimpsing of certain things becoming so important, because that is the moment in which you lose yourself. And so this is where also you we go back to that theme of what's on the one hand overdetermined, and on the other hand, this sudden possibility opened up where something that you are not conscious of, something that you are not prepared for happens. So in that sense, I like Rushdie's love of life. I think he's misread. He's been burdened with these tedious readings, and he himself has played along with it, of the work. Of course, I mean, it depends on a kind of trope, Midnight's Children, to do with the nation. But I think there's a lot else going on. He's not the only one who's written a narrative where a particular family is tied up with the nation. Spike Milligan of the Goons, the comedian, he wrote a book called My Part in Hitler's Downfall, which is all about how his family played a role in bringing down Hitler. I see Midnight Children more on that side than on Jameson's kind of national allegory side. So I think it would be fruitful to put him there with the surrealists, with the comedians, with Bhupen Khakkar, people he admires, than always in this professionalized kind of post-colonial department kind of emergence, post-globalization. That is an opportunistic and also unimaginative way of locating him and reading him in terms, reading his wordplay, so-called wordplay, a kind of weird word in itself, always in these kind of terms to do with the constitutional kind of markers of hybridity. When you read for wordplay or for linguistic play or for linguistic kind of variation, a passage in Beckett from page 10 and another from page 35, or from Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, you do not read both passages in the same way. Each passage is a separate moment. It raises, it brings back to our consciousness that no two moments are alike. Something that again goes back to the kind of novel that I'm talking about. No two moments are alike, but Rushdie's wordplay, whether it's on page 152 or page 13, is all read to be a kind of allegory of hybridity. The fishwives are kind of shouting at each other in the market, and this is wonderful, this is India, this is polyphony, and all of it is read in that way without actually looking at language. So again, we kind of reject the momentary in such readings, the importance of the momentary on behalf of something we already know. And I think that does an injustice to Rushdie as well. Anita, this I had not read. I mean, I respect her as a writer, but I know I have not read her as closely to be able to comment.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We could have gone on further, but I think it's a good idea to take questions from this point onwards.